I am recording today about children's ministry programming. This was this week's readings, and of course, it's what you spend a lot of time doing when you're working in children's ministry. You find yourself planning a lot of events, a lot of family activities, a lot of just play dates with kids, camps, VBSs, service projects. You'll be asked to do intergenerational projects with the whole entire congregation. And if you're not asked to do that, then that's something you might be seeking to do. You might be asked to coordinate worship services, and often children's ministers are asked to prepare children to participate in the worship service by presenting a special song or prayer or skit or something like that. Special events is very much part of children's ministry. I think that we have to ask some pretty big questions of special events and programming. There's a couple of things that kind of run concurrently for children's ministry. To me, the biggest concern to begin with is spiritual formation. We have to ask ourselves if we have a spiritual formation plan in place and if we are doing our best for that plan first before we add any other events. So this might mean, what are you teaching in your Bible classes, and how are you inviting children into the story of God, and how do they see themselves in that, and how are you encouraging spiritual disciplines and mentoring children in the practices of prayer and worship and giving and hospitality and so forth. You may also want to ask yourselves some questions such as, is there a place in our spiritual formation plan that encourages children and families to worship together, to develop those intergenerational relationships that are so important to mentoring and apprenticing and inviting children, not just to be part of activities at the congregational level, but to journey with the congregation and their mission of God. And so that is a difficult conversation to have often, because ministers and elders in other levels of ministry do not often have the same kinds of theological background that we have. What I would say about programming for children's ministry is first things first. And to know your vision and know your goals for spiritual formation, you have to make sure that you're doing those things well. And then you start to add in the extracurricular. And that's exactly how I view our programming as extracurricular. How does this enhance our spiritual formation goals for children? And what does it take away from if we are pursuing too many options? And so as you start to think about what programming you may have to enhance your spiritual formation goals, you have to make hard choices. And so here's the difficulty and where leadership comes into play in programming. First of all, just know that often you are going to be asked to put together certain programming that you may not feel called to put together. This is not unusual for children's ministers to have people drop in their office and say something like, hey, I know what would be cute for the kids to do, or I have this project and I really think kids ought to participate in this project. And you have to weed through those things based on your vision and your objectives and your priorities for spiritual formation and make those hard decisions. You also have to look at your resources in your congregation. We're in a smaller congregation, a medium-sized congregation of about 400 people, and attention in congregations between 250 and about 700, so I hear, I've not been in one bigger, is that often those congregations really try to emulate what the larger congregations are doing, the ones of 750, 1,000 and above, but with the resources of a congregation of 300 to 400. And so we put enormous pressure on ourselves to continue to add programming that is attractional and draws in parents and students and community members. And at some point, this doesn't work with your human resources and your financial resources, and maybe even your building physical plant kind of resources that you have. And so you have to ask those hard questions of, what is this program actually gaining us and pursuing it, and what is it taking away? So an example of this is at Kingwood, I chose a few years ago to stop doing a VBS like activity. We had VBS when I first came in, and we kind of played with it and did it in a couple different formats. And then I had a group of parents come to me and ask to do an art camp that originally they thought would be just for our kids. So it was just going to be an extra day camp for kids that are sticking around in the summer and their parents are at-home parents, and they were just going to put this together. So the first year we had about 45, which is about how many we planned for, and we saw potential in this particular activity, and so we let it continue to grow until it became about 250 kids and 4-year-olds through 5th grade. And so the important thing for you to understand is a congregation of about 400 serving 250 kids. We had as many kids and volunteers in our building for each day of this art camp as we would have in the auditorium on a Sunday morning. And we were fairly taxed. I had to use volunteers from our community to be able to pull this off. And it was wonderful because it allowed us to make connections into our community and inroads and relationships. And children love to be able to concentrate on art as an expression of worship. And we did some really cool big activities in the auditorium that were VBS like, but different than what we had done in the past. And it was just exciting. And our congregation loved it because they could see so many kids in the building. But we were stressed out, and my planners that put this together and myself, we had a committee, we worked many hours coordinating this particular event. And by the end of the summer, we were tired and our families were tired. And some of my planners would come to me and say, my husband said if I do this one more year, then there's going to be issues in our home. And, those are good indicators of a symptom of being too busy. And so we finally sat down and we looked at this particular event and we asked ourselves, are we bringing people to Christ? Are kids growing spiritually? And is the church advancing the kingdom? Is it serving in ways that it's showing compassion and mercy and spreading the gospel? And we had to be honest with ourselves that we may have been developing new relationships into the community, but most of those relationships had church homes, and we're really not in the business of stealing other members from other congregations, although we would love to have them come worship with us and grow with us and become connected with us. We had to be honest with ourselves that our time resources of our most dedicated volunteers was going into a 1-week event instead of 52 weeks of children's ministry classes and spiritual formation activities. We had to be honest with ourselves that it was taxing on the physical plant of our building. We used every single space available to make this happen, and often we would run into snags in the summer where there was remodeling projects happening and rooms were out of commission, and we were trying to make this happen, and it increased anxiety. We had to be honest with ourselves that in the 5 years of doing this and the probably 2,000 children that came through our doors, none of them had come to Christ that we knew of. None of them had become worshipers at our congregation and taken on baptism, other than those that were growing up in our congregation and a few people that were visiting our congregation anyway when they first started into this program. And so we had to ask ourselves all these hard questions, and then I finally made a decision with the committee's input, and we cut art camp. Looking back on it, I'm not completely certain I'm certain it was a right decision. I don't feel like we were able to replace it as far as the energy it brought to us. And so there's some good that was being done that maybe we didn't acknowledge, as the energy and extra involvement of our volunteers that may not be involved in children's ministry otherwise. But I also believe strongly in Sabbath, and this did not create space for our quiet time with God or for Sabbath. It created a much more hectic environment. And in the meantime, we also added an overnight camp where we stay 5 nights. At Disciples Crossing in Athens, we take kindergartners through eighth graders. We run a middle school camp and a elementary camp, and I direct one, and our youth minister directs the other. And I was the director of the overall camp session until this year, and I've asked our youth minister to take that on now. So sometimes delegating and bringing in fresh ideas is a great thing. And it was difficult to do both. And that was another thing. As a children's minister, you will need to assess your own time. You only have so much time to give. And so there's so many great activities, but when you only have so much time to give and you are responsible for Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, Wednesday nights, special events around the church building, what happens during worship, the extra stuff that elders ask you to be in, day camps and overnight camps, at some point, your time is limited and your ability to do things well is limited. And this is something elders often have trouble understanding. And it's something that we have to walk them through. So there's some basics on programming. I could tell you many ideas that are good for children's ministry, but honestly, those ideas are not important at this point. There's great resources out there. There's books and websites and Facebook groups. Lord Kate, you're already part of the Facebook group. I don't know, Sandra, if you've joined that or not. And those are places to get good ideas. When you choose programming for your congregation and you decide on those extracurricular activities you want to spend time on, you have to be able to understand the context of your church. Within the vision that you've laid forth for spiritual formation, within the resources available to you and your own time resources as well, and make good decisions for children that will help them grow spiritually. And so when I add extracurriculars to our programming now, my questions are those, and usually they end up being intergenerational events or they end up being service projects. We do a lot of times, I'm starting to add in on the Mondays that school is out for random holidays when teachers still have to go to school. I started adding fun days on those days because most of our people are in town, and I've felt like that was a good day for relationship building, although really just my youngest kids come, and so a lot of times it's 4 or 5 families that have 3 or 4 kids each, and they range from preschool to second grade. So it's good relationship building time for those families. It's probably not a holistic ministry kind of thing. I would rather our teachers and volunteers put their time into making sure that ministry that happens when the whole entire church is called together happens well. And so if that means the church is all called together on Sunday mornings, and that means we're going to make Sunday mornings work very well. And we're going to be attentive to quality during that time. Just like 2 more minutes before I have to stop the recording. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. There's quality versus quantity. I see a lot of church calendars that are quantity, and elders will typically ask you things like, what's on the calendar this month? How many activities are you going to have? And those are quantity questions. That's because their only definition of children's ministry, just a lot like youth ministry, is how much time relationally are you spending with kids? And that's a definitive success kind of question. But success isn't in the number of activities we put together. Success is in spiritual growth. And so that's when you have to reframe that question and you say things like, well, we could add a lot of things on the calendar, but I also know how busy these families are, and I would rather encourage families to have spiritual time in their home. Now, a pushback that they almost always give is, how do you know they're using that time for spiritual growth in the home? And honestly, you don't. All you can do as a children's minister is talk about it as often as possible, about how to nurture a child's faith within the home context. And, honestly, we're not all going to sit around singing Kumbaya all the time and reading scriptures to our kids. I believe so much more strongly in how we live our lives, and the humility that we bring into our family is more important than having an intentional, guided time every single day or every single week with our children. I feel like our spirituality is all a life. Now, part of that being all a life means that we're setting aside time and opportunity to grow spiritually with our families. And that as ministers, we're encouraging that growth to happen.